Well, folks, welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation Primer. Today, we're going to cover local government issues and in particular, focusing on what local governments can and should do in a time of crisis. You know, this continues to be a surreal time, to say the least. I think we're all in Texas sort of buoyed by the reality that our economy and society have reopened, albeit partially. And of course, one of the themes we're going to be touching on today, as we will in subsequent weeks, is how we can accelerate the pace of that reopening. Standing in the way of that pace, frankly, are a few, thankfully just a few, Texas localities who are helmed by elected officials who, for whatever reason, as we'll discuss today, have a desire to keep the economy and society shut down. And so today we're going to address that issue candidly and forthrightly, not just diagnose that problem, but hopefully provide some solutions and look ahead to the future, not just to the next legislative session, but also to subsequent pandemics. So what we're going to do today is, with our guest, James Quintero, our director of our campaign to focus on local governments and accountability, and Rob Henneke, our general counsel for the foundation, is emphasize that dynamic of state authority versus local authority, and in particular, highlight those examples of local authority that probably has not been used very well. I have a series of questions that I'll ask my colleagues, James and Rob, and as we get a little bit closer to the end of our time, of course, we'll pitch to you, the audience, who I'm sure will have a lot of questions. And by the way, thanks again for joining us. I think we're setting TPPF records for live stream attendance on these Monday events. And we know that you're not only busy, but playing your part in reopening our economy and society. So thanks for carving out some time for us. And we hope to give you a shot in the arm, if you will, of encouragement and hopefulness, but also a sense of what each of us can do as individual citizens to participate in accelerating the reopening of Texas. So James, I'm going to pitch to you first. You obviously have spent several years not only studying the local authority in Texas, but advancing some really important local government reforms, including in the last legislative session. Before we get into specific questions, I just wanted to pitch to you for sort of a 30,000 foot view of the situation that we're looking at in Texas as we reopen. What's foremost on your mind as we enter this new phase?
Well, thanks for having me on, Kevin. It's always a pleasure to speak with you about public policy. And I apologize if it looks like I've got a few bags under the eyes. My wife and I are blessed with a 10-month-old who is teething right now. I think she's actually coming in with all teeth at the same time. That's what it looks like. So we're enduring a bit of sleepless nights, but you know, when we look at the state of play in Texas, it is really encouraging to see the state move in a direction of opening. I think it's very encouraging that we're one of the largest states in the nation to begin tackling this process of re-engaging in economic activity. We of course want to do so safely, but swiftly. And I think we've taken a big step in the right direction, beginning as of last week with the governor's executive order to begin reopening the state. And so I'm really encouraged, but I'm also, you know, aware of the deep economic troubles that we face. You know, some of the latest job statistics are just staggering to think about. So late last week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out with some new data suggesting that unemployment in the United States had reached about 30 million people unemployed. That is a just staggering number. Here in Texas, we're looking at about 2 million unemployed. So we have a really Herculean task in front of us, at least as it relates to getting the economy up and running again. And so I'm extremely pleased to be working with such a prestigious institution to really put forward the ideas that we're going to need to get back to robust economic growth.
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks for the work that you're doing. I know from having worked with you closely on these issues, you've got some really sharp opinions, and we'll get into those. But I know a lot of our audience probably have tuned in just to hear those. And of course, very similar accolades for our friend and colleague, Rob Henneke, our general counsel. Rob, before we get into some specific policy questions for you and James, I want to pitch to you the same sort of overview question. I know, have a similar perspective to how James and I see this crisis, but given the fact that you're also an attorney and our general counsel and thinking about the world surrounding questions of legality, what are your general thoughts about the situation we're in, namely that we're reopening Texas and we're getting folks who are saying we shouldn't move this quickly, and at the same time getting folks who are saying we are not moving quickly enough?
Well, good morning. It's great to be with you. This is going to be a terrific discussion. I echo the sentiments that James has shared. The one fact that jumped out at me, I think, to further put into context the discussion about the unemployment numbers, if you look at Texas, and James is spot on, I mean, there's approximately 2 million Texans who've now filed for unemployment. Our entire state workforce is about 17 million workers. We have more people that live in Texas, of course, but if you look at the workforce, that workforce is about 17 million people. So we're climbing north of 10% now of unemployment. And you have to, don't just look at the state as a whole, but look at what the available number of people that are there. The legality to start with, and from a constitutional perspective, first of all, certainly the power in our society comes from people, and the consent to be governed, and the powers that come not from government, but come from the people. And those powers are reflected in the contract, which is really what we're talking about. We're talking about the Constitution, and we're talking about constitutional rights, both at the Texas and the federal Constitution. At times, the people have given consent for the government to interfere with our direct exercise of our liberty. But there are limitations on that. And there's two broad ways that those limitations reflect itself. First of all, the lowest level of scrutiny, when you're talking about government regulation, when you're talking about regulation under ordinary circumstances, or even largely here during the coronavirus, is government has to have a legitimate governmental interest. It has to be able to show with facts and data a justification for the power that it's imposing upon people and businesses. But more, stepping up from that, when we talk about fundamental liberties, when we talk about civil rights, when we talk about the right to worship, the right to assemble, the right to keep and bear arms, the specific fundamental rights guaranteed under the Constitution, those have a much higher protection. So in those situations, the government has to have a compelling governmental interest in order to supersede those types of rights. And let's also keep in mind that those are both fact-intensive questions. And so what may have been a legitimate or compelling governmental interest 6 weeks ago may not be the same set of facts here today. So just because the exercise of governmental power in some areas has been upheld by the courts or has been largely agreed to does not make that acquiescence of our rights permanent, nor should it. And we should be talking about current events and current circumstances when we are evaluating those in terms of how these regulations by the government under the justification of coronavirus are keeping our economy closed and also limiting the activities that we're able to engage in as free citizens.
So I want to, of course, jump into how this plays with the dynamic of local government in Texas. But before we get into that, just want to hang on this really important point that you've made, Rob, and it was very articulately said, don't get me wrong, but a little more implicit than explicit. And that is the way I would translate what you said, from your articulate lawyer, Louisiana public school speak, is that it's possible to believe in two seemingly contradictory things at the same time. And they're seemingly contradictory because of the role of the largely leftist media. And here are the two seemingly contradictory things. On the one hand, the response 6 weeks ago by just about every government in the United States to shut down either entirely or partially was justified based on the information we had, or for that matter, the information we didn't have about how contagious and deadly this virus was. And so I'm hearing you say you can believe that and all of the different government actions that came from that. But at the same time, I think what you're arguing is that today's different, that we know a lot more about the virus. In particular, it's not as contagious, it's not as deadly. And in Texas in particular, it simply has not been nearly the problem that it was in hotspots like New York and Louisiana. Is that something, James, you're nodding your head, I'm going to pitch that to you. Is that possible? Because I think a lot of our audience members probably have been grappling with those two seemingly contradictory points.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think the facts on the ground at the start of this crisis are different than they are today, and we have a much better grasp on the situation, which of course necessitates a different public policy response than it did 6 weeks ago. And I've been encouraged to see the governor come out and, through his executive order powers, supersede what I think are a lot of draconian rules that have been instituted on the ground at the local level, because I don't know that a lot of those rules and restrictions are necessary anymore. And I think the governor has done well to come over the top and redirect some of that bad behavior.
Good.
Well, and Kevin, to follow up on your point too, I think you framed it well, but it's not an all or nothing dichotomy. You can accept correctly that government has power to regulate certain aspects of our lives, which it does in ordinary circumstances. But you can also question the validity and the justification for that regulation. And that doesn't mean that you're completely denying any danger that existed from this virus. It means that you are exercising your judgment and your observation to point out where things are happening that don't seem to have a justification, which government's required to have.
Right. And so, pardon the additional follow-up question. Y'all, the two of you know that I'm just fascinated by this particular aspect of this unprecedented situation we're in. And that is, do we have an assumption by many or maybe most government officials that government knows best and that they've got to provide guidance or even requirements? In other words, that they can't trust us as individuals to exercise our rational self-interest? Rob, you want to start with that?
I do. I think you've seen that mentality in many of the jurisdictions. And I think that you can see the perspective from where the elected official personally is coming from as represented in the way that they are seeking to impose these mandates and orders. Certainly the default should be to encourage citizens to just be safe and to be prudent when exercising decisions. But when you see these, what I consider to be kind of heavy-handed, over-the-top actions by certain officials, many examples are in Texas, you're seeing many examples across the nation, that's where that elected official or that governmental entity is clearly signaling that we don't trust the public to be able to make its own decisions. And so we're going to come in under the force of law, under the threat of punishment and incarceration, and command people to act in a certain way. And you can only act in that manner if that's what you feel that role is for you as a governmental official, which I completely disagree.
Yeah. So James, I'm gonna ask you a question as we now make a segue from sort of these general comments to local government in Texas. I think maybe toward the end of the summer, as this virus threat continues to subside, we'll start analyzing thoroughly elected officials who really violated these principles that three of us have been talking about. And we won't mention anyone by name. That's not our MO here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. But we also will tell the truth even when it hurts. And so on the top three on my list, tell me if I'm mistaken or if you would modify this, would be New York City, the state of Michigan, and unfortunately, Harris County, Texas.
Yes, I think Harris County absolutely falls in that top three. And given some of the rhetoric and the judgments that have come out of that county, I may even move it into the top two. I was really surprised to see late April, just about 10 days ago, the Harris County judge came out and issued a new restriction requiring people over the age of 10 years and up to begin wearing a face covering. And along with that requirement was the threat of a criminal penalty of as much as $1,000 per incident, right? And so here we have local officials criminalizing the act of not wearing a mask. And what was interesting to me is you saw pretty swift reaction from folks on both the left and the right. So if you look at the response out of the Houston Police Officers Union, folks that we don't generally align with, I thought they were relatively spot on, because they criticized the fact that you are now putting police officers in the position of having to impose or enforce some really draconian rules when they were already stretched thin, dealing with some of the issues that we've already seen emerge in the Houston area as a result of other policy decisions. And so it was really interesting. And then from the right, of course, we saw Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick come out and call it one of the worst abuses of executive orders and the ultimate in government overreach. So, some really concerning behavior there. And what was interesting to me is, along with the message of you must wear a mask or face a fine, the Harris County judge also came out and said, you know what, this is not a police state, which is a really mixed message there, right? And it got even weirder yesterday. Just yesterday, the Harris County judge came out in a separate matter involving a tweet, a now infamous tweet, where she said that if you, fellow Texans, find other Texans not observing these rules and restrictions, we have a hotline and a form that you can fill out to effectively snitch on some of your fellow Houstonians. And so I find that to be really concerning behavior. It's unbecoming this great state, and it's just another illustration of where I think the Harris County local leadership has gone wrong.
Well, well said. Rob, what would you add to that?
Well, I would add on that too, is that the perception, the exercise of governmental power when, government is not being consistent and not being consistent in its messaging or its enforcement or its perspective of that. It was at the very beginning of this coronavirus, episode that, the op-ed that I published pointed out the fact that at that time, the city of Austin had just started its mandatory orders. And yet at the same time, you had hundreds of people in the Austin parks who were, recreating and enjoying themselves and being outside. And I don't criticize that, but I just point out that Austin was not enforcing its rules on its property at the same time that it was issuing these orders that were causing businesses to be shut down and causing tens and hundreds of thousands of people to be out of work. If you look at the Austin order, for example, which had a number of exceptions, and still just talking about the mask requirement. So in those situations where these municipalities have been spotty in enforcement, it really calls to question the legitimacy of the need for these orders, or whether you have power being exercised for the sake of exercise power, but only being enforced against selectively against certain populations, where government in this situation is not picking winners and losers, as we say in other situations, but government here is picking who to arrest, who to fine, who to enforce its rules against, and who not to. And that is not a consistent way for us to be governed.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder, and not from a conspiracy theory point of view, that's not what we do as a policy shop, about examples like the governor of Virginia clamping down on a religious service with I think 16 attendees. There's news this morning that the Department of Justice has decided to step in on behalf of that religious congregation. That example, I think the governor of Michigan has been in the news a lot for sort of egregious draconian implementation of the shutdown. And as you said, James, unfortunately, Harris County, which for those of you tuning in from outside Texas, and there are many of you, is Houston. So we're talking about a big county, not just in Texas, but in the United States, along the lines of examples the two of you have mentioned. It just begs the question, what's the agenda behind those officials taking such draconian steps? Because neither politically nor in terms of the data, that is the public health threat, do those orders make sense? James?
Yeah, here's I hesitate to say to say they do, especially given what we know now. And one of the other troubling things that I've seen come out of this whole crisis is that I think the statutes that a lot of these local officials are leaning on are either vague or being misinterpreted. And I want to point you to Tarrant County, which for our audience who may not know, that encompasses swaths of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And in Tarrant County, what you saw is the county judge up there lean on a particular statute to justify potentially commandeering private property. And that element was specifically included in his initial executive order that was issued in mid-March. He got some bad legal advice because if you look at the section of code that he went to, it did not give him that authority. And he later cleaned it up, but it was probably a 3-week period where this order allowed local officials to commandeer private property. That's very troubling. And I think it merits a lot of clarification in the coming session, at least with regard to our emergency management statutes.
Yeah, that's exactly where I wanted to go next with our conversation. And that is looking at the concept of preemption, which I think perhaps, James, you more than anyone made a bit of a buzzword in Texas because of the need to put so many of these overreaching local governments back in their box, whether it be annexation or tax elections or just transparency in proceedings. And so I'd like both of you to take a shot at that issue of preemption, that is creating sort of a single state standard during this emergency declaration, and how the governor of Texas, whoever he or she may be, has that power, what the limitations of that power are, even on behalf of the governor, but particularly the limitations on behalf of the local officials. We'll start with you, Rob.
Well, sure. So the basic idea of preemption, and let's stay just within the boundaries of the great state of Texas. The state of Texas is the primary governmental body, and all of your cities, all of your counties are what we can, refer to as political subdivisions. Well, basically, all of those cities and counties are created by the state of Texas, by the Texas legislature as smaller bodies of government. And the concept of preemption is that local government does not have the power to act contrary to where the state has implemented its laws and policies through the Texas legislature. So the state has passed a law. A city cannot adopt an ordinance that contradicts that state law. It's a basic concept there. But to your question about starting with the state power, first of all, the overall boundary of the state power is defined by the Texas Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the aspects of the Texas Constitution, which has never gotten a lot of examination. And so quite a few of these issues are issues that have never really come up before. And there are already a number of court cases that are making their way through the court system trying to unpack these type questions. Just to give you one quick example, Kevin, there's a provision in the Texas Constitution in the Bill of Rights, Article 1, Section 28, that says that only the Texas legislature can suspend laws. But there is the emergency statute under Chapter 418 of the Texas Government Code, where the Texas legislature gave to the governor emergency powers, including emergency powers to suspend regulations or suspend rules in some situation. So it's an open question in those situations that, did the legislature delegate its authority to the governor when it created this emergency statute that gives all of these powers to the executive branch to be able to execute? There is not a firm answer to that, but it's certainly something that we're seeing evolve in real time as everyone who holds public office, I think, is doing the best that they can. But you're having new situations arise where the governor and other elected officials are interpreting statute and doing the very best they can to discharge their duties. So it's not a firm answer, but when we're talking about these state emergency powers, we're talking about what has been defined by the legislature, but has never really been interpreted in this way or this situation, because this kind of event has never occurred before on a statewide or albeit national basis.
So James, help us out here to enhance or expand on one of Rob's good points, and that is the local disaster powers that local officials have. So once the governor of Texas steps in and using the code, Section 418, to enhance or to implement his statewide powers, do local officials have any leeway at that point? Or is this single standard, which we know Governor Abbott's been trying to develop, the law of the state at that point?
I think it's a little bit of a gray area in my mind. And I'm kind of curious because we have some interesting court cases and an interesting, at least one or two interesting Attorney General advisory opinion requests moving through the process right now. Perhaps the most well-known is out of Hood County. The Hood County Attorney's Office via Matt Mills has submitted a number of questions to the AG seeking clarification on, I think, some really pointed stuff. And just one of the questions, kind of going back to the Tarrant County example, where in the Texas code, if at all, does it say that local governments can commandeer private property, right? And I think that's a really good question to pose, because my hunch is that the AG will come back and say, well, they don't. There is no section of code that lets that happen. And so that will hopefully either help to educate our local officials, or maybe the conservative movement can take that and codify the AG's decision and move forward with some extra language there. One of the questions that I hope the legislature will address, or one of the issues I should say, is we need to do a better job defining state and local government's roles in a state disaster versus a local disaster. Because I think they're two different creatures that merit two different types of responses. If you have a hurricane that comes through and hits Houston, that localized event probably is going to be dealt with in a little bit different manner than a global pandemic that affects the entire state of Texas. And I think in that latter role, the governor has a much more of an outsized role to play in making certain determinations. And so that's one area that I hope the legislature will add a bit of clarity to and really help to draw some lines.
But I want to jump in on that real quick, if I may, Kevin. I agree with what James said, but let's not excuse current overreach at the local level because of, gray areas. I mean, in the statute, in Chapter 418, which is the emergency powers statute, that's pretty much everything we're talking about when we're talking about state and local response to coronavirus. I think it's very clear that you had two different categories of events that were contemplated by the legislature in creating this statute. You had the category of local disasters, and you had the category of state disaster. And to me, the way that the context of that statute reads is that it's not the same disaster. It's not the same term. You're talking about two different concepts when you talk about local disasters versus state disasters. And so if you look at the context of the statute, then I think it already signifies that when you have a state disaster, which we may have never had it happen before in Texas, agreeing with James that most of your disasters occur in a single county or a small region of Texas, then the state takes charge, the governor takes charge. And it's really the role of counties, county judges and mayors to act as, the agent to act at the direction of the governor in being the local leader for their community, but acting pursuant to the direction and guidance that the statute gives the governor in addressing statewide disasters. I think that already exists, and that certainly makes sense when you look at how government is organized and what really are the differing roles between our state government and our statewide elected officials, as opposed to the smaller elected officials at the city and county level.
So just to round out this conversation thread about the next legislative session, we of course know that the legislative session will be dominated by the state budget situation. And we've touched on that in some other meetings of our live stream series. So I don't think the three of us need to do that today. It's not going to be pretty, is the point. But I'm curious, what else concerning this emergency in particular do you foresee the legislature reviewing? A lot of our audience members over the last few weeks have asked if, in fact, the legislature will hold hearings about some of the gray area, not as a way of poking at the current governor, but as a way of understanding how to better handle future crises. James?
Sure. So because I'm a fiscal guy at heart, let me tackle the property tax issue, because I see a large fight looming, at least as it relates to the interpretation of a provision that was included in Senate Bill 2. And Senate Bill 2, for those who don't know, was the big tax reform bill that was passed in the last legislative session that promised to tamp down on excessive property tax increases. So it was supposed to be that this coming fiscal year, which for most jurisdictions starts October 1, they were going to be limited in how much property tax revenue they could collect. But because there was a provision related to disaster declarations included in the bill, you have some nefarious folks on the left, guys, folks like the Texas Municipal League and to some extent, their proxies, who are arguing that that provision allows cities and counties to circumvent that new 3.5% revenue limitation and instead revert back to the old system, which allowed us up to an 8% tax increase year over year, right? And going back to my original comments, we have millions of Texans who are unemployed as of right now, probably millions more who are underemployed. Now is the absolute worst time that we could move toward a tax increase. And so one of the things I've been encouraged to see is that the bill authors of Senate Bill 2, Chairman Betancourt and Chairman Burrows, have both come out and said that the legislative intent of including that provision was to cover disasters that resulted in physical damage, not necessarily the government imposed sort, right? And to some extent, the governor, I believe, has also come out and indicated the same. So you have a little bit of tension there mounting about how fast property taxes can grow in the coming fiscal year. Again, that situation is going to probably come to a head in the late summer, early fall of this year. Even if local jurisdictions observe that 3.5% limit, though, I think we still have a property tax crisis on our hands, given the state of the economy. I expect some big property tax reform proposals to be entertained in the next session. I hope to be right in the middle of it, because property taxes in this state are out of control, and we need to do a much better job containing the growth and delivering meaningful tax relief.
Yeah, and it just as the full impact of not really the virus, but the economic or government response to the virus was becoming known to taxpayers. They're receiving their appraisal notices, which of course reflect a January valuation. And obviously, in almost every case, that's not just a little bit higher, but significantly higher than what the market value would be right now. So I think that reality will fuel continued political pressure from the bottom up, right? I mean, these are individual taxpayers who may not even be all that political, but they know that simply does not make any sense whatsoever. So that will be one way that will be very involved in the next session. Rob, I'll pitch that question to you, and then we'll take the first of our audience questions.
Well, thank you. So I've already mentioned the need to be explicit in what I see as implicit in the chain of command under the emergency statute when you have a state disaster. But one other need for reform that I would recommend is the need to give the Texas Attorney General specific power to defend infringement upon civil liberties and fundamental rights under emergency situations when you have unequal exercise of that power. Even going forward in the future, when you may have a local disaster, there are situations that we've seen over the last 7 weeks where government has not been consistent in its restrictions, and those inconsistencies have targeted some of the most fundamental rights. And giving you a real quick question, I mean, there has been a lot of criticism levied about the restrictions upon people being able to worship at their places of worship, at the same time as where other types of businesses or other locations were allowed to stay open. And I mean, I certainly commend Governor Abbott for coming in quickly and being very explicit that he was protecting the right to worship and the right to be able to do so. But, you know, if he hadn't have stepped in, it's really kind of been left to individuals and private entities to have to assume the cost to go to court to stand up for themselves or to push back. And we've seen those examples outside of Texas. So, you know, in situations where you may have an immediate attack on civil liberties and fundamental rights that is not justified or that's not equally being applied, then that could be a very correct role for the Attorney General on behalf of the people to be able to step in and, you know, make sure that those issues are properly defended and properly raised in the courts.
Thanks for that response. Well, gentlemen, as is no surprise to the two of you, our audience already has several questions in the queue, and we'll work through as many of these as we can. If you've joined us and you're interested in asking a question, just type that into the comments box. The first question will be about other examples, whether they be a different country like Sweden or a different state like South Dakota, that in effect did not shut down. What's the relation? Well, we'll just stick with that as a follow-up question. Do those examples of that country, that particular state, provide us as Texans some additional confidence that we can hasten, we can accelerate the pace of the reopening? James?
Good question. I thought Rob was going to get all the hard questions. So yes, you know, one of the great things that I've seen come out of the Trump administration is that he seems to have put a renewed emphasis on federalism, allowing governors and elected officials in each state to some degree to make command decisions about the direction of their economies and what types of restrictions should be in place. And so I think it certainly merits, it would be good for us, once we get through this crisis, to go back through and look at different states who maybe have similar geographies and similar demographics, and see whether or not they imposed tougher restrictions or looser restrictions, and what were the consequences of that. And given the diversity of Texas, I think it certainly merits treating different regions in a little bit different ways if you're the governor. One of the things that I was pleased to see come out of the governor's office on Monday was, via his executive order, he effectively stipulated that if you lived in a rural community and you had, I believe it was 5 COVID-related fatalities or less, then your business environment was going to be subject to a little bit different rules and regulations. So I believe instead of observing a 25% occupancy limit, they kicked it up to 50%, and it'll probably, go up from there come May 18th. So yes, to your question, I think it's definitely worthy to look around once we get through this crisis and figure out who did it well and who did not.
Rob?
Kevin, I disagree already with the efforts by many in the media to want to blame somebody. That seems to be, whose head can we put on a pike? And that's not productive. It's certainly not, dealing with the ongoing challenges that we have. So I'm looking back, not to place any blame, but just to kind of contextualize where we are and how we started from. In March, when these orders began to be put into place that were closing businesses and ordering people to put home, the justification at the time was that was needed to be done to flatten the curve, to reduce the spread of contagion. Now, people today are saying we need to stay home because we don't have a vaccine, and the goalposts keep seeming to moving. Let's go back to where we started from, and that the justification was to stop the spread. Well, we know now a couple of things. We know now that the period of time with which a person who's infected may be infected and has no symptoms or not know it, it's much longer period of time. And so you could be walking around for weeks without having any idea that you may be positive. We also know that this virus was spreading itself in our country months earlier than we anticipated. And so I put all of that in context because we have other examples now where there were not the stay home type quarantine orders, where we're seeing that for the most part, excluding those who are the most vulnerable, people were able to adapt, that you didn't have this rampant spread of infection and disease and deaths that were out of control. And so that can certainly give us a lot more confidence as we move forward in a safe way to reopen Texas, that, the immune systems our bodies have, the healthcare system we have that's able to treat people is in a position to deal with this as we go back to a more open, normal type way of our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to find the particular headline to your point from a left of center media outlet. And if I were more technologically savvy, I would have put this chart on the screen. James is laughing because he knows that's true. But I think the two of you and maybe some of our audience members will be willing to believe me that there's a very popular left of center media outlet, Axios.com. And there you have a chart in their email this morning. I think it's the second news story. And the chart shows that the curve was flattened 3 weeks ago. In fact, the curve is declining. But the headline is, as something along the lines of, as Republican states reopen, cases persist. And I think that's a word of warning to all of us that you simply can't trust everything you read and everything you hear. And you particularly need to be suspicious of these headlines. I think what that's doing, and I'm very, very serious about this, goes beyond the typical conservative concerns about bias in the media. This is affecting not just the economy and society, it's affecting individuals' lives by continuing what I think is a largely unnecessary shutdown at this point. And so when you have headlines like that, when you have local media outlets, both the newspaper in Austin and a couple of TV channels, basically writing the same headline as a way of embarrassing Governor Abbott and trying to slow down the pace of reopening, I'm telling you from think tank land, there is no data in Texas that suggests that's the case. In fact, I think there are two forms of data that we need to be looking at. The rate of positive tests in Texas, that is declining as testing goes up. As testing goes up, there will be more cases found, right? But the rate of positive tests is declining steadily with each passing day. And even though the number of cases is increasing, the number of hospitalizations is decreasing. And I think that's crucial. So it's almost as if the number of cases in Texas is irrelevant from a messaging point of view. I had a colleague earlier today say, well, it's essential in terms of running the math equation. I said, yes, I understand that part. But I think it's really important that we understand the lens through which we need to be reading these media reports. So you'll be seeing more from TPPF, including this afternoon, but every passing day, really highlighting the, I'll try to be as charitable as I can, how much we should question those media headlines. So
well,
we'll go to,
I mean,
go
Kevin,
ahead.
if I can just, I mean, a statistician once said that all stats are relative, but let's point out, I mean, the original assumption was that this arose in mid-March. We know now that's not the case. This has been going on in our country for many months, more than that. But here also, and look, every loss of life is tragic, and that impacts the families and everyone else. I mean, it's not callous to try to contextualize, as you're saying, what we're talking about here. But if you look at that, this has been going on for all of 2020. The equivalency in deaths is about the same statistically as those who die every year from Alzheimer's. There's other types of comparisons, and I think this has been going on for a long period of time. To say that we've started to get a handle on the spread of contagion and the numbers and kind of what this looks like. So yes, we want people to be safe. Of course, we don't want anyone to die from this, but let's also put this into the context in terms of all of the numbers and to push back against those who want to just cherry pick individual statistics as a way of inciting panic or causing fear or trying to inflame passions on this issue, because that's dangerous and certainly not productive.
That's right. In fact, I've become fond of saying in the last several days, because we believe every life is precious, all of us at the Texas Public Policy Foundation want to see this reopening accelerate. We are harming lives by keeping our economy and society shut down. So a couple more audience questions before I'll pitch to each of you for some closing comments. The first of those two final questions is about the contact tracing. And Rob, I'll pitch this question to you. Our audience member asks, how can state governments institute tracking systems? I think the motivation behind that question is, how do they have the power to do such a thing?
Well, let's recognize there's two different things. One is currently public health agencies across the nation currently do and have for decades, if not longer, had kind of public health type tracking. If you have a particular outbreak, when, say for example, there was the I think the Ebola outbreak, a couple of years ago, you had health agencies that came in, and if a person showed infection, they would try to figure out where that person had come from and also where that person had been in contact with. So that part of it is normal. And that's really all that we're talking about here, at least within the context of, the state proposal, where you're talking about voluntary reporting, and you're also talking about public health officials just following up on, incidents of contagion to try to alert people they may have been exposed, so people can self-quarantine and so forth. Certainly, you've heard about examples, or you've seen in the movies, maybe some more draconian examples. And if you were using police powers, if you were forcibly, arresting people who might have been affected, or interfering with people's liberties, or doing things that was tracking citizens. I would have a lot of concern about that. But there's currently, I don't understand that anything that's happening right now is more so than just the ordinary way with which public health agencies have responded to severe outbreaks.
Yeah, thanks for that. And for that audience member who asked that question, and all of you know that the Texas Public Policy Foundation has screamed from the rooftops that any form of contact tracing needs to be 100% voluntary, and that's just the principle by which we operate. So James, I'm going to ask you the last question from the audience, and that is about the budget situation next year. We have some early projections from the comptroller. This audience member says about a 7% reduction in the budget. Basically, the question is, should we expect that reduction in the state budget to be 7%, or do you see that as this economic crisis deepens, especially considering oil and gas here in Texas being worse, that is requiring a higher cut of the state budget?
Well, I think there's certainly the potential for it to be worse than what initial projections suggest. One of the curious things that's kind of happened is we've had two crises hit us simultaneously. The first, of course, being the government-imposed shutdown, and then the second being all of our various troubles with oil. And both are going to have a meaningful impact on the state budget, which is going to be a difficult task, but not one that is impossible to overcome. And what we've been doing at the Texas Public Policy Foundation to try and prep the battlefield, so to speak, is to remind lawmakers that they have numerous tools available to them, all of which they should be taking full advantage of right now, because we know, whether it's bad or whether it's terrible, we're going to need to lean on these tools heavily. And so, just a few things to highlight for the audience. One is, of course, zero-based budgeting. This is a tool that was used to great effect back in 2003 when TPPF's own Talmadge Heflin was chairing the House Appropriations Committee. He came into that session down $10 billion and was able to bridge that gap without raising taxes. It was a huge achievement back in 2003, one that I think can be duplicated again in this coming 2021 session. And for those who don't know, zero-based budgeting is just the process of completely deconstructing the budget, working hand in hand with your agency heads, and then building it from the ground up. You find a lot of inefficiencies that way. Another thing that we've been encouraging our state leaders to do is to conduct a third-party efficiency audit of all agencies and institutions of higher education. I think you can find a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse that's accumulated over the years, and really potentially either use that money to bridge the gap, or even send back to the taxpayer in the form of meaningful property tax relief. Other ideas that we had that we've been kind of championing. Let's begin finding cuts now. Let's look for 5, 10, 15% reductions in our existing budget in anticipation of more difficult times to come. In fact, Talmadge again was out in the Austin American-Statesman, I believe it was the Austin American-Statesman this weekend, talking about the need to find those 15% reductions for every agency and begin really prepping. I've been hopeful that we can see maybe a state agency hiring freeze, or take a look at wages and compensation, because generally personnel is your greatest expense when you're in the position of government. So a lot of these things can be done in the lead up to the legislative session. And of course, when we get there, the comptroller has suggested that we're going to be several $billion down. And that's just as of right now. Who knows what the next 6 months hold. So we've got a big task in front of us, but we have the tools, and I hope that we'll have the right mindset to go about closing that gap without tax increases. It can be done.
Yeah, amen to that. So obviously the TPPF will be holding the line on that as well. So we have just a few minutes left, gentlemen, and I want to give each of you a minute, sort of a lightning round, each of you a minute to give words of encouragement for our audience. It's how we've been trying to conclude each of these sessions. Rob, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you. And, this is Texas and the Texas spirit that we have. One of the things that I've been encouraged is just seeing the many examples of neighbors helping neighbors and people reaching out to those who've lost their job or may not have been able to go to the grocery store or other things, of just making themselves available, offering to help with childcare. That's what we need to have as a society. I think this has been a great example of how we can work with our neighbors. We can help our community. We don't need to have the government to come in and become our caretakers. We need to be the ones who become responsible for ourselves, responsible for our families, responsible for our neighbors. So as we get back to work, as we see that there are millions of Texans who are struggling right now, I think the encouragement should be for us to make it our responsibility to help that person out, to help them get back on their feet, to make sure they have enough to eat, to make sure that someone's checking on an elderly neighbor. Let's make that our job as Texans and grow a Texas that's going to be strong again and independent again, and the type of state and community that we know it is and we always want it to be.
Thank you. James.
Sure. So as I look around the state, I see a number of trouble spots. We've got, when it comes to local government overreach, a lot of really bad examples, from Travis County, Harris County, Dallas County, Tarrant County. There's a lot of really bad behavior going on, but where I've been really encouraged is I see my fellow Texans not rolling over and taking it. It's been a really positive experience to know that not only the good work that TPPF is doing, but the movement as a whole is being carried forward in very real terms by average Texans who are not going to lay down and let their liberties be taken away from them from these local government tyrants. And so I would encourage my fellow Texans to continue on with that spirit as we enter the next legislative session. It's going to be an absolute necessity that we have that fire in the belly and that we're able to put a lot of this activity back in the box and in some cases stamp it out entirely, because there's too much resting on it.
Yeah, that's well said. So James Quintero, Rob Henneke, thanks so much for joining me this week. I will say that in addition to your words of encouragement and of course the excellent policy analysis that you've given us, that I would encourage each of you as audience members and friends just to get out and live life. Last few Sundays, I've taken my wife and kids down to Town Lake in Austin, and each Sunday there are more and more people out. People of different stripes, people of different backgrounds. I'm sure we all have political differences. The point is, you can't subject a free people to an indefinite shutdown. And that's something that I know Governor Abbott knows. I think most of our elected leaders in Texas know that. Let's not let the handful who have platforms because the media will amplify their message, who want to keep us shut down from being free. Get out there and live. We trust you as individuals, as business owners, to decide what safety protocols are responsible for you and your family. But let's just pledge to one another, starting at this moment forward, that we, not any government, are going to be the ones who decides when we reopen the economy and society. And let's do that now. Thanks for joining us. We will be back with you next Monday. In the meantime, you know how to reach us. God bless you, and God bless Texas.